Yeah, hi, Uday and Raga. I think it's important. Dan's presentation that we've just been through is extremely interesting. It's a wonderful take on what is potentially a very challenging leadership coming in to take control of what is the biggest country by far in Southeast Asia. In fact, it's 40% of ASEAN's GDP. It's also by far the largest in terms of political clout, not to mention it's 17,000 islands and it's 270 odd million people. So I think it's important to give a counter view for our clients. I think Dan's perspective on Prabowo is from his first-hand experiences and his personal relationships with both him and his entourage. And it's also from a man that's very heavily into the resource sector, very optimistic, and living in Jakarta, close to the concentric circles that govern the country. Obviously, Indonesia shifted a long way away towards special autonomous, away from central authoritarian control, and that new constitution, decentralized control, and now there could well be a pushback to centralized control. I think, Rugger, it's probably good to just recap some of those points that um, Dan made in relation to Prabowo. He was in general very, very positive. What would you say were his key points?
So, Paul, Dan's views of Prabowo are quite favorable. He covered off on this particular term called Prabowonomics, and it is in his book, the book that Prabowo wrote. The
Yes.
goal of this particular strategy, this national transformation strategy towards Golden Indonesia 2045, is to achieve an 8% growth, which would be the highest GDP growth in the last 10 years. At this point of time, it's about 6.3%, I believe. And Prabowo covered off on how this is quite an ambitious achievement to even dream of, and it would be quite difficult to do so. But he means to do it. Largely, Dan was of the opinion that a lot of the welfareist programs that are being rolled out right now would lay the foundation for that level of GDP growth in Indonesia.
Yes.
Dan also, yeah,
Please go
sorry,
ahead.
yeah. And Dan also covered off on how the minimum wage has been raised. There's a national food program which costs about $28 billion.
Yep.
And there's a lot of infrastructure projects that Prabowo is undertaking, although there will be some delays in the, let's say, the capital city project, the IKN.
Yep.
So there will be a mix of priorities for this government because it is quite an ambitious feat to look at self-sufficiency with food, and Prabowo is going to look at that. But some of the infra projects could take a backseat.
Yeah, and look, I was very interested in the larger macro picture, how that's going to be funded. Also, what the relationships with particularly the West, but also with China, how that's going to evolve, and what are the impacts of prudent financial management, and what's going to be the bigger picture on the foreign investment scenario. Indonesia basically is a net exporter on energy, but for oil and gas, it's not spot on if you consider the fact that they've got an abundant level of coal resources. They can be, but of course, then that's going to have other impacts in, in managing carbon emissions and how that's going to be interpreted by the Western world, the privileged world that wants everybody to help bail them out of the carbons that they were particularly strong in emitting. So, if I look at potential investment with Prabowo coming in, if I look at potentially more centralized control, a larger autocratic way of doing business, it's certainly an advantage on the domestic scene to minimize the layers and numbers of people involved in corruption. It may or may not have the same impact on reducing collusion and nepotism, which are much harder, much more difficult to control just by bringing it under a central autocratic personality. But Are we going to see a trend, you think, that blue chip multinationals may lose interest in Indonesia and that there may be legal uncertainty and a lot of policy inconsistency that may lead to the wrong kind of investors coming into Indonesia? So credible, large, um, very uh, well-heeled and virtuous investors leaving Indonesia because they see it as too risky and not synergistic with their brands, and more, let's put a polite term on this, agile investors coming in because they see an opportunity that's easy to navigate when corruption is pulled under one little central control center. Raga, you got a view on that?
That's right, Paul. Like you said, as much as we're looking at a pretty high growth rate that's been projected from the finance ministry, the more centralized the control is, and there is talks of increasing involvement of military-linked people within administration. There is a strong likelihood that Western businesses will be slightly risk averse, and there could be a decline in high quality investments. There could be legal uncertainties, and it is coupled with the ongoing policy inconsistency within Indonesia. We often see how Indonesia propounds that it will follow climate sustainable goals, but on the other hand, they're opening new coal plants and commissioning new projects which arguably go against its very goals. So, coupled with all of these um, uncertainties, there could be a decline of high quality investments.
Yes, and also there could be a lack of sensible, well-considered leadership that understands you have to make statements and then fund them. Now, if we look at the statement he made, I think it was in context to Papua, we're going to put another 100 battalions into Papua. Was that Papua or raise another 100 battalions in Indonesia? Can you recall?
I think there is increased deployments in Papua, Paul. It is going to be corresponding to the increase in the TP and PB forces as well.
Yes, and the concern there is use of a term for a guy that headed um, Indonesian special forces are going to raise 100 battalions. Well, you'd like to have him talking in terms of divisions and brigades if that was the case. But I'm concerned that by thinking he needs to just pull things in under control, send out military, get things under control, he could well forget his history and how Indonesia pretty much lost Timor-Leste, how Aceh is continuing to be a basket shape, um, how there's political uncertainty there now, and the GAM have just lost political leadership because of their corruption and inability to switch from being an organised militant group against the nation to be effective politicians. The Papua situation, really, if an Indonesian military of 1 million odd people can't get that under control, with what it's got now, creating more battalions seems to be more about potentially filling pockets for people that helped election victories rather than actually an operational necessity in the field. Because if you're not competent, you don't have the right equipment, you don't have the right training, getting more of you is only going to exacerbate the disorganisation and the unprofessionalism. So I am concerned about that. I'm also very concerned that, you know, we touch on that theme that the wrong type of investors may be attracted to Indonesia in that growing um, uncertainty away from things like ESG, away from things like um, involvement of society and the involvement of the people towards, hey, let's make another run on our failed effort to centralise who can run for elections, and they need to be special mates in Jakarta. If they continue to be loose like that, I'm concerned also from a political perspective that other powers are going to come in and step in, and that a lot of the noteworthy high tech, particularly oil, gas, mining investors, get disillusioned and they're backfilled by, you know, potentially Chinese companies that may not be concerned about ESG, and Indonesia loses technical input, experience, clean mining, clean oil and gas. So I think there's a lot to be concerned with when you look across the archipelago and you look at the history of how Indonesia had to implode to get itself past autocratic leadership. And let's face it, corruption was centralised, literally centralised to one family. If we start going down that path again, then it could be, an extremely difficult scenario. And if Indonesia starts to align very closely with China at that political level as they come in to fill the void, there could be some real negative effects. Not only are they going to potentially be exposed to negative flow-on effects from the US tariffs and policies that are likely to come in under Trump, and indeed some of those have already come in, but they could also be subject to some kind of sanctions and tariffs if they get too closely aligned to China, or if they seem to be moving away from a real democracy and becoming more of a pretend democracy. Rugger.
That's right, Paul. I think that increasingly Chinese investors have been involved more and more in Indonesia, and the conformity to ESG and typical Western norms might not necessarily be the move from a Prabowo-led administration. While it is aware of the geopolitical realities and balancing and hedging between the great powers, they're also quite nationalist in the sense that they are going to pragmatically follow their interests. And that would mean that if China is coming in with bigger investments and not necessarily scrutinizing their standards, ESG, human rights, labor concerns, they're probably going to go the China way.
And look, I think Dan made a significant point that I think Indonesia's learned a lot from its foray with China doing a lot of nickel mining in Central Sulawesi and not necessarily being too concerned about the environmental labour issues, and it led to some pretty ugly global images on Indonesia. But if we look at the global comparisons, typically investors are looking for high quality investment locations. They're looking for jurisdictions with very transparent legal systems. Indonesia's legal reliability appears to be not suddenly going to get a shake up and become better. If it's centralised, we can see what is already a fairly dirty system. That legal system its reliability may diminish, and we may see investment flows from really, high quality investors be diverted to other more attractive locations in ASEAN. Think Singapore, think Thailand. If companies are really that way inclined, also think Vietnam. But Indonesia's apparent concession to China on overlapping claims in the South China Sea, that potentially undermines a decade of Indonesian very clever strategic diplomacy, and isolates Asian partners like Vietnam and the Philippines. So I think Prabowo's ego and the fact that he owes a lot of people a lot of money, and that he can be very inconsistent. He was raised to hate the Chinese by his father, but he seems to be okay with the Chinese if it involves money flowing. So I'm really concerned about some issues, and when they really need to set up, Kevin O'Rourke made a very solid point in his recent Reformasi Weekly that, have they got flawed self-sufficiency goals? It's going to be really difficult to anticipate where Prabowo is able to take the economy, even though it is a country that vests a lot of power in the president. It isn't a very 100% supporting parliament that's going to react to what they do. There are a lot of oligopolies, and a lot of oligopolies with a lot of interest to feed. And with his social spending, expanding spending on military food, social programs, really risking inflation. It can potentially erode public confidence and outsider confidence and really complicate business planning. So I think the impacts for businesses are that there's a lot of unpredictability and uncertainty entering the environment, and that there's a long-term potential contradiction in that if policies are uncertain and that short-term changes are being made, it makes it very difficult to make long-term investments. So look, I'm very warmed by Dan Bowman's views, and I respect his views greatly. I think when we can get a chance, it would be wonderful also to get Kevin O'Rourke on and have a brow bash with him about it. But any other points you'd like to make, Rugger?
Paul, just as you'd said, there were some instances of policy inconsistency that I'd like to highlight.
Yes.
Um, so there were a lot of talk of the government looking at plans to retire all power plants within 15 years and focus on renewable energy. Now, when the government comes out with certain policies like this, you are going to see more investments coming in from the renewable energy sector. However, on the other hand, the implementation of these policies don't necessarily go hand in hand with what they say, because Indonesia still heavily relies on coal for energy. There is no clear step-by-step plan. So this leaves a lot of investors in the lurch because they're practically hung out dry from what the government says to what the government does. So these are just smaller examples of a larger problem with the system where there is quite a bit of confusion for investors. Businesses are looking for certainties in Indonesia, and while the president and the top people from the government come out and say something with the sovereign wealth fund or anti-corruption actions, for example, but the opposite happens, that's not a very clear path, especially for an aspirational economy like Indonesia, when you're seeing investigations into corruption bodies happening. And some of them seem to be politically motivated rather than to better governance. These give a lot of questions for investors where they they practically lie in this larger corrupt system. So just to
Yes.
support your points, a lot of investors are looking for clear a clear path which Indonesia needs to work on, needs to give a clearer sense of direction.
And look, if I'm sitting on, a 10 or a $20 billion investment, if I'm sitting in Houston or London managing that side of a potential, unless I specialize in collusion and nepotism and therefore can pretend I'm not involved in corruption, I'm not going to be putting my 20 or 10 or $20 billion into Indonesia with that amount of uncertainty. And when I see a president that is coming in and saying, I'm going to expand military functions into the civil domains, and I'm basically going to go back and do it better than Suharto used to do it, even though it ultimately fell to bits. The Suharto family and their cronies were great beneficiaries, as were the rings of toxic oligopolies around them that's prevented the nation moving forward. It really does. It creates inefficiency. It diverts military focus further away from defence, which it's always been very questionable as to, what is the percentage of effort that goes to military focus from the Indonesian Defence Force and how much is it in running businesses and running political aspirations. And it also enables corruption. So it's a loss in my view, unless you're a beneficiary of one of the oligopolies or one of the privileged families of those that get appointed to boards, of those that benefit financially. I don't, unfortunately, share my great mentor, Dan Bowman's optimism about the time that's going to evolve under Prabowo. As a former military officer, I get the concept. I'm Australian. It's very difficult to say anything favourable for me about the efficiency of the public service or politicians in Canberra. But even though they brush over a lot of things and pretend that there isn't corruption in Australia. There are enough balances in place that occasionally they hang someone. But in Indonesia, I fear we're going down a path that is going to move further and further away from civil governance. But it's already sending signals that, hey, we're making policy from our hips with weapons. We're blindfolded when we fire those weapons. Our policies and our legal jurisdiction was always loose, but I'm not seeing realistic clarity come out other than statements. But when you dig into those statements, there isn't much substance in terms of how you're financially and prudently going to manage them. And if you look at, the pressures being exerted on Sri Mulyani to make competent decisions about finance that are incompetent, if she's a big indicator is if she says, hey, look, obviously you want to do it that way, but not alongside my reputation and expertise. So I think these are some of the key indicators we need to look at. That this whole military involvement in civil affairs, the whole Dui Fungsi thing, that's of a major concern that we're even talking about that being a remedy in a country that has evolved so much as a democracy since the downfall of the Suharto era. Hopefully they'll get it back together. But let's cut it short there, Uday, unless you've got any closing comments, mate.
No, Paul, I think you and Raga covered a lot of points in a good amount of time, so I think we should release this as is.
Okay, great. Raga?
That's it from me, Paul.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Thanks for your time. Cheerio.